Okay, good morning, everyone. I see we have a couple of people still waiting to sign on. Let's give it another minute or so before I introduce our speaker at our final webinar session hosted by AfriSam this morning. So if you just give us another minute or so to get a few more people online, and then we'll do the formal introduction and get on with the webinar series. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final webinar hosted by AfriSam. Today we have with us, and we're very privileged to have him with us today, Vusi Thembekwayo. He's an acclaimed business mogul and global speaker. It is true, but that is not Vusi. Vusi is many things, from a maverick, a leadership genius, a petrol head, a family man, a self-made millionaire, to a dragon. At 25, he ran the R400 MN division in a 17 billion multinational, and today is widely regarded as one of the most disruptive forces in venture capital in Africa. Vusi is a consummate professional speaker, on stage and off stage. He's a globally renowned speaker. For those of you who haven't seen him go viral a couple of weeks ago, lots of energy. I've known Vusi for many years. I've been privileged to work with Vusi back in the early days when Vusi got going, and to have seen his career blossomed in the way that it has. I'm truly privileged and proud to have seen how Vusi has gone from a junior young man who was very proud to meet Nelson Mandela at a very early stage in his life and to get to where he is. And just before I hand over to Vusi, just to give everyone a recap. So AfriSam embarked on these webinar series as part of a CSI type initiative to try and get people to connect with people like Vusi and various other renowned speakers on a platform that they would otherwise not have the privilege to connect. The idea is not for AfriSam to influence the content or to tell the speakers what they may or may not speak about, but it's just to create a platform that people may be inspired, informed, educated about where we find ourselves in this pandemic, in this crisis, but also to get advice from people like Vusi and the various other speakers we've had on the platform. So if you all recall, we started our first webinar with Dr. Azar Jamin from Econometrics, and that was during lockdown level 5 when things were extremely depressing. He gave us a view on the global economy as well as the South African economy and what this pandemic is going to look like. And he gave us some projections as well about either a U-shaped recovery, a W-shaped, or an L-shaped recovery. And as we are now, in terms of our industry, things are maybe a little bit of a mixed bag. Because after Dr. Azar Jamin, we had David Metalkamp zoom into the construction industry, and he gave us a sense of what is happening with infrastructure spend, where things are likely to go. And as I said, things are a bit of a mixed bag because the bulk side of the construction industry not quite doing well, but the bag side, cement sales going through retail stores has spiked to the extent that we are even battling to keep up with demand as we speak now. And we are having to think about putting in additional capacity to make up for the extra demand that we are seeing. So mixed bag from that front. Then we had, at a personal level, we invited a life coach, a lady that we've worked with in AfriSam, Karen Dubau, and she gave us some hints and tips on how to manage in a crisis. We have these virtual meetings where we hardly get to meet our staff, our colleagues, and all the good work we try and put in to create a company culture and an environment is very difficult to do in a virtual sense. So Karen gave us some good advice, and I'm pleased to say that in the next week or so, I would be seeing my colleagues and my team for the first time as a group since lockdown, and I can't wait for that. Then our last webinar before this one was with Maya Fisher-French. Maya focused on personal finance and giving everyone good advice on how to go about managing your personal finances, managing your debt, getting debt insurance, getting the right advice, the TERS funding from the UIF, and various other good tips and good advice, especially for the many families who had indicated, because she ran a poll, and during the poll, there was a high number of people who said they think that they could be affected either themselves through retrenchments or their spouses or partners. So personal finance was quite an important topic to cover at the time, and we received great feedback that we were able to put Maya Fisher-French on a platform like this. So today we go beyond the crisis because life has to go on. I mean, as difficult as things are, as tough as the economy may be, and whilst there are some very real practical issues we have to confront, not just as a business, but as a country and as the world as a whole. I mean, if you look at the Americans and where they are heading into an election with all the violence and the issues that are happening, the social challenges that they have, and there are many other countries that have their own challenges. But we have to look beyond these challenges, and we still have to live. Many of us have young children who look to us for hope and inspiration. And life is what, as much as we all need money to live, it's not just about money. We have to raise these young people and try and encourage them that, you know, even many years ago, the world experienced crises like these before. This is not the first crisis. And if we didn't have people who raised us properly, we wouldn't be where we are today. So we've all got a challenge. And Vusi has got the challenge today to take us through this next stage and to give us a perspective on things beyond the crisis. So Vusi, when you're ready, I will start the presentation. Over to you, my friend.
I'm ready. Thank you so much, Richard. I remember one of the very first and very early engagements you and I had, Richard. We flew out to Bulawayo in Zim, and you had me work with your team out there. Probably it must be over 10 years ago. So I'm humbled and privileged that you continue to be a friend to me personally. You're an inspiration, and the things that you've done are incredible. So thank you. Let's get started. Let's rock and roll. So welcome to everybody in on the webinar. What I thought I would do in terms of this conversation was really try and look beyond the curve, right? Because I think that there's so much happening at the moment, so much information, so much data, and so much news. I don't know about you, but I feel completely inundated with the amount of news that are out there. You know, just yesterday I was reading this article about what's happening with the first trial of vaccines that I'm sure you would have seen in Russia as it is, and how that's now had an impact on the capital markets in Europe. As we speak, the NASDAQ, as the S&P 500 and the FTSE are seeing record levels of trade and liquidity, whilst the economy is bleeding and hemorrhaging. So it's almost as if that disconnect between the financial markets, what's called the secondary capital markets, and the real economy where you and I live is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And all the while, if you come to our own continent of Africa, we continue to face the same issues that we've always faced around leadership, political leadership, corruption, crime, et cetera, et cetera. And even here at home, those issues continue to be topical. So if you're in business like me, I imagine it's hard to see the signal from the noise. I spend a lot of my time really trying to pick up the signals because there's clearly a lot of noise out there. And I was trying to explain this to my executive team, actually just this morning in a team meeting. And I said to them, remember when you were a little kid? I remember when I was a little kid, if you were watching the TV and you couldn't catch the right signal, You had to go and stand next to in my house, we had a room divider. You had to go and stand next to this little room divider and hold up the aerial and try and catch the signal. That sort of gray scale, that was the noise. And I feel like there's a lot of that going on at the moment. There's a lot of that noise. What we're all trying to catch is a clear picture. What's the signal, right? And so what I hope to do this morning is to focus a little bit on what is the opportunity, where does that opportunity lie, how are leaders leading at a time like this to capture and optimize that opportunity so that we can all find the signal through the noise. Because ultimately, this must end. I could focus on the macro stats. You've heard them. You had Dr. Jermaine, for whom I have an inordinate amount of respect, a few weeks ago, talking. In fact, I dialed into that conversation. Actually, I was in the delegates room, and I listened to Dr. Jermaine's presentation. It was thorough, it was lucid, and it was fact and substance based. Of course, Dr. Azar is very quantitative in his analysis, right? So he had all the graphs. So we could do that, but at the end of the day, that would tell us what's happened and it would give us a sense of what's around the corner. What I'm really more interested in is how do we lead? You and I today as managers, directors, executives, and or even founders and entrepreneurs in businesses, how do we lead? And I'm going to focus my time today on that. So one of the things I thought to do was to just give a sense of context. You heard Richard make the comment, and he's 110% on the money, about how we think that this crisis is a deep crisis. Make no mistake, the crisis is deep. But what it means to be a human being is to be adaptable. That literally is what it means to be a Homo sapien, is that you and I have the ability to adapt from living in the caves to living in cities as we do today. And we often forget that actually human beings have been through far, far worse. I saw this beautiful video done by a friend of mine who works for the New York Times. It was a montage, and he said, and the video went something like this. If you were born in the 1900s in Europe, by the time you were 14, you were at World War I. By the time you were 19, you had the Spanish flu. By the time you were 23, you had the Depression in Hungary. By the time you were 29, you had the Depression in the US. By the time you were in your 30s, there was a second flu. By the time you were in your 40s, you had World War II. So by the time you were approaching the age that I'm approaching now, 35, I'm 5 years away from 40. At that time, you had already been through several cataclysmic events. In my lifetime, this is the first one, right? And so we kind of tend to think of this event as the end of the world. The truth is, the world actually is very stable. It's more stable today than it's perhaps been in the history of human beings walking the face of the surface. Big statement, but I would argue that we can find the substantive facts to back it up. This is where I want to get us started. Interesting work done by an economist called Angus Madison. He worked with the United Nations, the University of Gronenberg, as well as The Economist, the magazine. And what they did was they framed the world's economy since the death of Jesus. It's literally called the Jesus Project. The dark blue line is the rate of economic growth. You and I know it as this thing called GDP, gross domestic product, which is a function of infrastructure spending, social spending, imports, export, etc., etc. And what you notice between the 1st and 17th century is a linear growth in GDP, 18th, 19th, and then 20th century, this massive exponential rise. Most people forget this, but think about it this way. The world's most powerful economy today, with the world's largest capital markets, the world's largest military industrial complex, the world's largest advertising industrial complex, and the world's largest middle class, the United States, that economy today, in global economic terms, is a teenager. The US was founded and birthed in 1776. The Gettysburg Address, 407 years ago, was 1776. If that seems like a long time ago, I want you to recall that Jan van Riebeeck arrived at the Cape of Good Hope 100 years before that. So we think about the world and time in this quantum, right? And in this continuous space, but actually it's kind of that big. 20th century is 100 years. And what you've seen is the 20th century has been the most prosperous century for mankind. The lighter blue line is global life expectancy. Today, as we speak, we're going through a global health crisis. But consider this. You today can go, if you have the common flu, and I mean the common flu, not the virus, but the common flu, You go to your local pharmacy, you buy yourself ACC 200, some Corenza C, you get yourself some oranges for enough vitamin C, you go home and you self-medicate. 100 years ago, if you had the common flu, it could kill you. So we often don't remember that actually we've made massive advances in technology, in biotech, in healthcare, in capital markets. We've completely connected our world just in the past 100 years. The point, there's never been a better time to be a species called a human being on this rock called planet Earth. Not for the past 2,000 years. So I know we're going through a lot, but this is perhaps the best time to have been a human being. If this is the best time, and I'm arguing here that it is, then one of the questions for us to ask for ourselves is, why is the world today even more unequal? Certainly more unequal than it's been over the past 80 years. And there's a big question, and I want to frame that question because I think that's where I want us to start. For me, many people see inequality as a risk. I see massive opportunity in the inequality construct, because if there's inequality, it means that somebody has to catch up, and catch up means growth in economies, growth in middle class, growth in credit, growth in consumption, growth in spending. That means there's going to be growth in jobs, growth in businesses. So for me, the inequality construct actually presents massive economic opportunity. But all I've done here is I've given you high level. There's inequality. So let's maybe dial into this inequality, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 4 key economies in Africa. 4. I want to give you the macros of those key economies, simple high-level macros. And I'm going to compare them with similar economies in Europe. And I want you to get a sense of the potential for economic growth. Just have a look. Before we go there, I want you to pay attention to this graph. This is a fascinating piece of work. It was done by the good people at the Washington Post, who partnered with Gartner, as well as McKinsey. And here's what they did. They looked at access to electricity, or penetration of electricity and power in the continent of Africa. The dark blue is the percent of the population in that country that does not have access to reliable power. Notice something interesting. The North Africans, north of the Sahara Desert, have got their act together. Do you see that? Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. They've got their act together. Strong access to power. As we speak, Morocco's got a strong program looking to unseat South Africa as the global capital, as that global access to capital markets. What does that mean? Morocco has designed a financial product. I know because I work in the financial services space. And in fact, about 3 months ago, even Rand Merchant Bank, through their Covest business, published a study showing the amounts of incredible progress that Morocco has made. And today, what Morocco is looking to do is basically unseat the JSE. Think about it. If you were a global investor controlling a pension fund and you wanted access to developing markets and you wanted to invest in Africa, where did you go? Well, if you wanted to invest in telecoms in the African continent, you bought MTN on the JSE that gave you telecoms to Africa. If you wanted to invest in banking, you bought Standard Bank on the JSE that gave you access to Stanbic in the rest of the continent, right? So South Africa and the JSE has always been this base for global capital to access economic growth on the continent. Morocco is working very hard to unseat us. The reason I make this as a comment is because I think that competition will be very healthy to bring our economy back into its full firing again. But notice Central Africa. That really is where the opportunity lies. So I want you to pay attention in West Africa to a country like the Ivory Coast. 70% of people in the Ivory Coast don't have access to reliable electricity and power. 98% in Liberia, 94% in Sierra Leone, one of my favorite countries in the world. In Buki, as we call it, Burkina Faso, the chairperson of my own firm is from Burkina Faso, right? 83% of people in Buki don't have access to reliable power, 87% in Guinea. Those numbers won't stay like that forever. Nigeria, I've traveled several times to Nigeria. We have an office in Nigeria with a partner network there. Nigeria, 55% of people in Nigeria don't have access to reliable power. These are massive opportunities for the leaders of those countries to fix, and they will do. And what happens when you connect people to power? Well, several things. The minute people are connected to power, factories get built, founders start building services-based businesses, which by their very nature are high margin. the middle class starts to grow, credit markets start to grow, and the economy grows. So there's a massive cascade effect in just unlocking the power construct. Look at that's West Africa. Look at East Africa. Ethiopia, 76%. South Sudan, 97%. That's an insane number. If you come further south, the Congo at 85%, Burundi, 88%. The point I'm making, there's massive economic growth still. But you and I have to see around the curve. So let's base case our economies. I'm going to give you those 4 economies again. I called them for this presentation the 4 horsemen. The first one I want to introduce you to is Egypt, North Africa, 95.6 million people. Here's the number I want you to pay attention to. Their GDP per capita is $3,500. GDP per capita is an economic measure where they take the total quantum of GDP divided by the population of that country. It's $3,500. The middle class is 31% of the population, 32 if you round it up. And they've got incredible high numbers of access to electricity. But if that GDP per capita is true at 3,500, and the middle class is only 30% of the economy, if you were to compare them with a country in Europe, it would be Armenia. Now look at the size of the Armenian population. 3 million people has a higher GDP per capita. The point I'm making, massive upside opportunity still for a country like Egypt. Let's come home, South Africa. That number at the beginning, by the way, is supposed to be a 5, not a 9, beg your pardon. So that's supposed to be 55.96 million people. But South Africa is 5,200, 300 give or take GDP per capita. Our middle class at the last count was 19.8%. Admittedly, these are 2019 stats. Of course, off the back of COVID, there is an expectation that the side of the middle class will drop. We're not quite sure if the quantum is yet, so we left the number the way it is. But even South Africa, fairly high access to electricity. But notice something. If our GDP per capita with a middle class of 20% is 5,200, then we're comparable to a country like Serbia, which has 7 million people. Massive economic growth for South Africa. Still, if we can take the number of people who are in the excluded informal markets, formalize them and bring them into the formal sector, that middle class will grow, and that will, of course, push up our GDP per capita. Huge economic upside still. Look at Morocco. 24 million people, GDP per capita, 2,800. Who would you compare that to? A country like the Ukraine, 45 million people, 2,100, opportunity upside. And then finally, Ethiopia, spoke about it earlier, one of the most populous countries in the continent, 90 million people, and look at how low that GDP per capita number is, less than $1,000, yeah? With a middle class of 8%. And comparable to, in Europe, Nepal, 28 million people. So the point is this, there is huge economic upside just in rebuilding the base. What's the base? Strengthen capital markets, make it easier for businesses to be able to raise capital, liberalize the economy, yeah, attract foreign investment, give the best people opportunities, middle class will grow, and the economy will rebuild itself again. So even though there's a lot of worry, I have to tell you, I'm working at the moment on a Pan-African fund. In our firm, we're busy raising a Pan-African fund. We're very excited at the conversations. We're having conversations with all of the major donor firms all around the world, all the major limited partner donor firms all around the world, and all of them are finally seeing the continent as a massive economic springboard for growth. Now, I use those words very specifically. They're not seeing it as a donor springboard. They're seeing it as an economic springboard. They want you to present the economic case, not the donor case. So, what do I think are the things we will need to do to capture this opportunity? And here's perhaps the outcomes for you and I as managers and leaders, right? What do we need to do? There are 5 things we know that leaders who lead through periods of crises do well, particularly to ready themselves beyond the crisis. The first is to embrace mythology. Every single society, every community, every sector, and every business has a series of stories, narratives, myths that hold it together. These are the stories that we tell ourselves to be so true, they cannot be changed. And I want you to cast your mind back. The year is 1993. We're having political violence in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela leads a project to create this beautiful story piece called South Africa, the Land of Peace. They, if you remember, composed that song, South Africa, we love you. Remember that? Yeah. That whole time was Nelson Mandela trying to capture the essence of what it meant to be South African by creating a mythology and embracing that mythology. Fast forward 10 years. A man called Thabo Mbeki is now leading the African Renaissance. And he writes the now iconic poem, I am an African. I owe my being to the hills, the valleys. Yeah? What was he doing? He was embracing the mythology. The very fact that in the US they talk about the American dream, something that can't be written down, but every person who goes to the US subscribes to it, tells you that what they're trying to do is to embrace mythology. So let's bring this to you. I want you to remember when your mom told you to eat your carrots because it was good for your eyes? Do you remember that? Yeah, my mom used to tell me that. It's not true, by the way. There is no scientific evidence linking carotene to eyesight. None. So where does it come from? How do we globally, throughout cultures, believe that carrots improves your eyesight? Where does that come from? In World War II, in the Royal Air Force Navy, the British were experimenting with a type of technology that we today know as radar technology. And they gave it to a single pilot. He was one of the best pilots at the time. And he would fly out at night and he would fight the Nazi planes at night. He had a far higher hit rate because he had radar. He could see the Nazi planes on his screen. But he loved carrots. In fact, he ate a carrot a day. Now, because it was a skunkworks project, that means an innovation project, not allowed to share it with anybody else in the regiment or even in the Air Force, people thought he could see better at night because he ate carrots. That's where that myth comes from. And yet today, what is close on 80 years later, you still tell your children, eat your carrots because it's good for your eyes, with no scientific evidence. So the question I want you to ask yourself as you make notes on this is, what is the myth that you can tap into right now about how you work, how your firm works, how your industry works? I want you to find a specific moment and time when you were challenged and you thought it was all going to be up for nothing, and you found a way to bring it all back together. That's the story that you've got to use to reinvigorate people. In fact, if I was giving any advice to our citizen number one right now, it would be this. Find that myth of what it means to be South Africa again, and what it means to be a South African, and galvanize everybody towards that single messaging, right? Embrace mythology. Number two, try to be agile. And the thing about agility is it means that you've got to look for inspiration in adjacencies. I'll say it again. Agility means you have to look for inspiration in adjacencies. You can't find agility looking for inspiration in your vertical, in your echo chamber. Simply said, if you're looking for new ways to do things, look outside your own industry. That's where you're going to get the best advice. The man in the picture is well known to most of us, I imagine. That's Mike Tyson. Arguably the most ferocious fighter of all time, without question the most dominant fighter of the second half of the 20th century. But the man sitting to his left, what is yours and my right, is less known, but without whom Mike Tyson wouldn't have been the success he was. His name is Cus D'Amato. He was Mike Tyson's trainer. Cus D'Amato trained Mike Tyson in a form of martial arts called peekaboo. Now, notice my language. He trained him in a form of martial arts called peekaboo. They applied that form of martial arts called peekaboo in boxing. And what the form of martial arts was about was minimal movements, maximum punches for impact, always come from underneath the opponent, and uppercut for the knockout punch. If you watch the first 21 professional fights of Mike Tyson, 20 of them he won by knockout. 19 he won exactly the same way. Minimal movements, comes from underneath the opponent, boom, out. The point? The reason Mike Tyson was unbeatable for those first 21 fights of his professional career was because whereas the other boxers were training in boxing, he was training in martial arts. So look for inspiration in industries that are adjacent to you. But how can you do this? That's the question. How do you actively look to do this? I think in terms of one of the ways to start thinking, all of us across our businesses, I remember when I went to business school, we were taught to think in the frame of demographics: age, gender, race, background, education. And anytime you were building a product and a value proposition, you thought in terms of demographics, right? But the world has changed. You know, right now in South Africa, there's a kid living in Diepsloot who's never been outside Diepsloot. He wears his pants cut really low. He wears a very big baggy t-shirt. He's rocking these heavy boot-like shoes called Timberlands or something. And he says, yo, man, like he comes from New York. He's never been outside Diepsloot. Why is that? Well, that is quite simply because the internet has collapsed borders. So whereas we used to have demographics, now we only have psychographics. People today relate with people all around the world, independent of whether or not they share the same geography. Today, it's about, do we share values? So one of the things leaders are doing today is they're tapping into the psychographics of their teams, they're tapping into the psychographics of their market, and they're tapping into the psychographics of their consumer base. Not demographics, psychographics. So how do you do this? Well, one of the things you got to realize is that the idea of what value is changing. I come from an era where value was prescribed in a particular way. It's changing. How's it changing? Well, first, how you frame your identity is changing today. We come from an era where we had the binaries. Now we don't have binaries anymore. It's not male and female. It's not black and white. There is a kaleidoscope of identities in there. So you have male, you have female, you have LGBTQI and plus. And we're still discovering in that the other forms of identity. So identity is changing. Black Lives Matter is a function of identities changing. It's people going, I want to be seen and recognized, right? Not a political statement, but about the shift of identity. The second is the idea of the archetype of masculinity is changing. I come from an era where there was a specific masculine way you did things. Well, that's changing too. We're learning that actually brands that are doing better are softer, more human, more humane in how they talk, how they engage, and how they get into markets and engage with people. The archetype of masculinity. The idea of wealth, massively changing. We come from an era where wealth was about money. Now all of a sudden, wealth is about health. It's about time. And that's perhaps one of the things that's come out of lockdown and the virus, right? We're realizing the amount of relationships we were leaving abandoned because we were busy, right? Fourth, this I think is the biggest one. The idea of free. And if you're in this conversation, I want you to ask yourself the question, what are you offering for free today to your markets, to your consumers, to your clients? You got to offer something for free. Why? Because free is the new premium. You get in on free and you upsell into what is called freemium. Everybody in this conversation, I imagine, has a Facebook account. You've never paid for it. So how does Facebook make money? So you got to really start thinking about how do you leverage this idea of free as a business person to build your potential, as well as to build your brand and to build a customer base. Free. And finally, legacy. One of the ideas around how value is changing is people are finally rethinking what their legacy will be. What will we leave behind? When it's all done, what will we stand for? So the point I'm making is we used to think of this very grayscale way of demographics. Now it's a kaleidoscope of color and psychographics, and it's all framed by these shifting 5 ideas of how value is evolving and changing. Because if you truly want to be a leader that builds a great organization that comes out of this crisis doing better, you've got to understand the 3 constructs. First, IQ. This is the data, the analytics, the numbers, the stuff a finance guy like me spends his time doing every day, going through the data, the analytics, and the numbers. Then there's the EQ, tapping into the emotion, the psyche, the moment. But all of those without the ability to be adaptable, to frame it around the 5 things I've spoken about, doesn't deliver truly exponential growth. To truly be agile. How else are leaders leading at a time like this? This next one is an exercise I'd like everybody in this conversation to try. I've done it myself. I promise you it's very effective. So one of the things that happens when we go through periods of crises And there's a beautiful book written by the general, I can't recall his name now, I can see his face. And the book is called The Fog of War. And what the specific general talks about, he says, before we go to war, everybody has a plan. The minute we fire the first bullet and we smell that residue of lead, right, and the gunpowder, he says the plan is out the window. So all plans get demolished by the fog of war. He says the role of leaders is to remove themselves from the noise and to see things into context, the past, the present, and the potential futures in plural. So here's how you do it. Write a letter to the next person who's going to take over from whatever job you're doing. And write that letter and tell that person the crisis you've been managing over this period of COVID and the things you've done over this period of COVID to go through that crisis. Then in the letter, you document for that leader the business, the way you've left it for them to take forward. So why did this exercise? Because like many businesses, when COVID hit, we went straight into lockdown, 21 days, the president told us. And I remember having a management team and like 21 days, we could do okay with 21 days. 21 days was extended and extended again and extended again. By the time we were 90 days in, calling an emergency management meeting and saying, we're clearly not coming out of this lockdown anytime soon. We're in a services-based economy. We had, as a sign of good faith, gone out to our clients and said to them, we'll put all of your retainers on hold until we get back into the fold again. So you can imagine it. Revenue drops to near zero. Fixed costs stay the same. But what does that do to your runway? Completely depletes it. What happens to your business plan? Out the window. All of a sudden, you go from managing a well-run, highly cash flush business to managing a crisis. Called a board meeting, and my board went, well, if you don't do something soon, right, you're going to have a serious problem. We're either going to have to do some sort of rights issue and raise more capital, and or there's going to be issues around trading recklessly. So you have to do something, right? So what did we do? The things we did in that series of time are all the things I documented in that letter. Tough decisions, really, really difficult decisions. Kind of decisions where you can't sleep at night decisions, but you take them in that moment because in the letter I documented to the next leader who takes over from me was, this is the business I have to leave behind for you. Now that next leader could be me. It literally could be me a year from now taking over. But the point is I had to step outside of the crisis, write the things down, see them in context, and understand the sacrifice in the context of the payoff, which is about sustaining the business for the future, right? Next, understand when disruption occurs. And I think this is what most leaders in big organizations don't understand today. You need to build a culture in your own organization that enables you to take a hold of the massive opportunities that are happening right now. So in my space right now, massive opportunities, and I can tell you very high level. Number one, we're seeing a collapse of the marginal players. Small marginal businesses are folding. They don't have the balance sheet. They don't have the runway. They don't have a capital structure to support them through a period like this, so they're folding. But as they're folding and moving out of the market, they're leaving the customers that we were all trying to catch for. So what's happening is the bigger players are becoming bigger, right? And it's happening. You're seeing the consolidation all over the place. Any market you're seeing right now, it's a consolidation and a rebuild of the oligopolies. The small companies are going away, and that's going to create massive space for new entrants to come in again. It literally is burning of the forest so that new trees can grow. That's what we're going through. So what do you need internally in your own culture to capitalize on this? Well, what you need is an environment of sharing, collaboration, and trust. Very difficult to do, particularly in large businesses, right? Sharing is difficult to do because, well, in large businesses, we like the idea of credit. We like being credited for our work, right? This project was won by this division. It belongs in this P&L. We literally have the languages for it. It goes into this cost center. It belongs in this P&L. Sharing actually goes, it doesn't matter who takes the credit for this. We're all going to work together so that we can deliver on the outcome. Second, collaboration. Collaboration means that I have to set aside my own KPIs for the collective KPIs of the organization. Very difficult to do. But none of this is possible unless you have an environment of trust. Do you trust each other? Can you take a step back internally for 6 months and actually trust each other? Know that the person working on the other side of the divide will do the best thing for you and the best thing for your team. Very, very difficult. So You can't capture market opportunity and disrupt the market unless you have an environment where there is true sharing, where there is absolute collaboration, and when there is a real trust. And the question for you is, do you have those? Because ultimately what you're trying to see is things the way they are, the way they used to be, and potentially the way they could be. So we always talk about the world of hindsight, perfect science, stats, analytics, data. If I asked you today, what did you do, net operating profit, less adjusted taxes a year from now, you go into your financial system and you can pull the data. Hindsight, 2020. If I ask you today, what's happening in your market right now? Insight. You call people, you get a sense of what's happening in the environment, in the market. You can write an A4 document going, this is where our economy is today. We literally heard in the intro, Richard talk about where the market is today. That's insight. Foresight is going, so where are things going? Where is the new potential? Where is the new market of opportunity? And that's kind of the macro stuff that I started with earlier, the big macro cases, right? That there's still an opportunity for things to be done. So the point is to question what you're seeing. And then finally, and this is my final bit, and then I'd love to take questions. So finally, ask yourself whether or not the people who are your heroes became heroes in an environment that you are operating in today. I'll take it a step back and say that statement in a way that is a bit less cryptic. Every practice that we look up to, every culture that's well established, every business leader that we revere became a practice that was embedded, a culture that was set in place, or a business leader that accomplished what they accomplished within a particular context. But if you change the context, sometimes the competencies don't translate. And so one of the things you try to look to do is to be actively disappointed by your own heroes. That's how you push the boundaries of what is next, what is possible, what is future. I'm going to ask Richard now to help me by clicking and playing this video to give you guys a sense of what it is I mean when I'm talking about truly seeing beyond the curve and truly being disappointed by your own heroes. Richard, would you hit play for me, please?
People who've been in the rocketry business for decades, who say
people
about
who've been in
you
the rocketry business
that
for
you
decades,
don't know what you don't
who
know.
say about you
I suppose that's true of anyone.
that you
How can
don't
anyone know what they don't know?
what you don't know. Well, I suppose that's true of
When
anyone.
critics
How
say
can
you
anyone know
can't
what they
do
don't know?
this, your answer to them is,
We've done
But
it.
when critics say you
He's done
can't
it
do
in
this, your
partnership
answer
with
to them
NASA,
is,
which has
"We've done
given
it."
SpaceX
He's
technical
done
advice
it in
and a
partnership with
contract
NASA,
worth up
which
to
has given
$1.6
SpaceX
billion,
technical advice and a
mostly for
contract
12
worth
cargo
up to
flights to the space station.
$1.6 billion,
But
mostly
SpaceX's
for 12
lack of
cargo flights to
experience
the space
bothers
station.
some NASA
But
legends, like
SpaceX's
Apollo
lack of
astronauts Neil
experience
Armstrong and
bothers
Gene
some
Cernan.
NASA legends,
They've testified
like
to
Apollo
Congress that the
astronauts
Obama
Neil Armstrong and
administration's
Gene
drive
Cernan.
to
They've
commercialize space
testified to Congress
could
that the
compromise
Obama
safety and
administration's drive
eventually
to
cost the
commercialize
taxpayers.
space
Now
could
is the time
compromise
to
safety
overrule
and
this
eventually cost the
administration's
taxpayers.
pledge
Now is the
to
time
mediocrity.
to overrule
you know, there
this
are American
administration's
heroes
pledge
who
to
don't like this
mediocrity.
idea.
You know, there
Neil
are
Armstrong,
American
Gene
heroes
Cernan
who
have
don't
both
like this idea.
testified against
Neil
commercial
Armstrong, Gene
spaceflight in the way
Cernan
that you're
have both
developing it. And I
testified
wonder what you
against
think of
commercial
that.
spaceflight in the way that you're
I was very
developing
sad
it.
to see that.
And I wonder what you
because
think of
those
that.
guys are,
I was very sad to see that because
those guys are heroes of mine, so it's really
yeah.
tough. I wish they would come
those guys are heroes of mine,
and
so
see the
it's
hardware
really
that we're
tough.
doing here.
No, I wish they
And
would
I
come
think that would
visit
change their mind.
and see the hardware that we're doing here.
They inspired you to do this.
And I think that would change
Yes.
their mind. They inspired you to
and
do
to
this.
see them casting
Yes.
stones in your direction.
And to see them casting stones in your direction.
Difficult.
Did you expect them to cheer you on?
It's difficult.
Thank you, Richard. You can stop it
So
there.
help-
Did you
Hoping they would.
expect them to cheer you on?
What are you trying to prove to them?
What I'm trying
So
to
they're
do
hoping they would.
is to make a
What are you
significant
trying to
difference
prove to
in
them? What I'm trying.
So, what's the point that I'm coming to, particularly with that video? You know, today, Elon Musk has created businesses in whose enterprise value, the combined sum of their enterprise value, is a third of South Africa's GDP. Think about that. And then consider that less than 10 years ago, SpaceX near on bankrupted Elon Musk. Then you consider that just 10 years ago, all of us were going, what is he doing with this electric car thing? He sold out PayPal, take his money and just go on holiday, buy an island, right? Do what any reasonable person would do. And he pushed the boundaries. I want you to imagine you trying to build a space business and the very first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, tells you to stop. I want you to imagine what that would feel like, right? And so the point I'm making is this. South Africa, make no doubt, is challenged, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We're in a difficult time. But the only way we're going to come out of this difficult time is if we work in a way that enables us to actively seek to be disappointed by our heroes. They brought us to where we are. They've given us this incredible miracle of a democratic South Africa that's free and fair, where you and I can have the right to voice our opinions. But if we are to truly rebuild it, we're going to have to be actively disappointed by our heroes. And so what I hope for you is a spirit and a tenacity that is comfortable in pushing the boundaries beyond the reasonable. What I wish for you is the ability to understand the myth and mythology of your industry, your space, your sector, your company, and to truly embrace it. What I wish for you is the ability to understand hindsight, insight, and foresight throughout this period. And most importantly, what I wish for you is the ability to remain ever creative, ever inspired, and ever inspiring. Thank you very much. Richard, back to you.
Thanks, Vusi, for another very inspiring presentation, very insightful indeed. And you've touched on some very important key points that hopefully people will apply. I certainly will be writing a letter to the next leader that is going to take over sales and marketing at AfriSam, or potentially even HR at AfriSam at the moment. And I'm sure some of you also have visions of people who are in developmental roles that will be succeeding you. Who knows, maybe I might also still be in the same position next year and I can read my own letter. But thanks, Vusi, for a great presentation. We have a couple of questions. Firstly, just apologies for the sound in the video clip. I know it was a little bit of a double sound there, but I hope you got the message. I must also say thank you to all of you for attending and signing in on this webinar. We've, I think, got the highest number of people that have signed in so far on the webinar. So thank you all for signing in. I'm going to start with the first question. I think there are two questions that come from colleagues of mine at AfriSam. The first one comes from Peter Buerta, and he says, with the current economic situation added to an uncertain future, how do we convince investors / shareholders to bankroll investment in expansion projects?
Yeah, tough one. That's a tough question. And it's a tough one. I'm literally going through that process right now. So writing up the prospectus, building the investment case, and saying, look, the macros don't look good, but there's still potential for the upside here, right? So I think there are a couple of thoughts there, Richard. The first thought is, again, try and frame it on the macros and show what is still the potential and the economic upside. The second is, my world is interesting because I spend my time raising money and then investing money, right? So I both have to be the optimist when I raise money, and then I have to be the pessimist when I'm investing money and look for the risks. What you never want to do anytime you're raising money is to downplay the risks. The investor will see through that. So what I do with my own team, with my own board, and now as we're busy in the capital raising process, is I put up all of the risks up front. These are the risks. This is the stuff that can go wrong. And once I'm done with that, I go, and here's the things that we have no control over. We don't have control over the macroeconomic policy of the country, none. I have no control over the political direction that the country could take, none. So this is the space where we don't control. But where do we have control? And I then frame the business case around issues where we have control. So what we've been doing is we've been looking for the potential, what we call the green shoots, big South African term, which means where are the bright sparks, right? Then we go, here's the economic opportunity in the bright sparks, and here are the controllables for us in that economic opportunity. That's a lot fairer, a lot more sanitized, and a lot more deliberate conversation to have with a potential investor. And that's what I would recommend.
Great. Thanks, Vusi. The next one comes also from a finance colleague of ours, Famidia Campbell. She says the concept of there being a whole lot of opportunity has been one that we as Africans have been faced with for a very long time. What, though, will be that catalyst to assist us with this? As a continent is fraught with corruption, nepotism, bad governance, how do we get over that hurdle? How do we get people to actually really become positive in an environment, even as we see now, you know, the tender systems that are fraught with corruption, the whole issues around PPE. I mean, there's a lot of negativity at the moment, but I think, and I'll leave you to answer the question, I think the point is that if you look at the world, the one place that still has the best opportunity for growth has to be Africa. But we know there are lots of things to fix in Africa. And maybe you can touch on those things.
So, I mean, so let me just say this, right? That there is a reason we know about the corruption, the fraud, et cetera, et cetera. It's because it's being reported on. And I think we often overlook that because it seems like such a, well, duh. Well, yeah, it's being reported on, which means that there is still some level of media freedom. In fact, if you look at what's happening in Zimbabwe today, not a political statement, but if you look at the journalist that's been jailed, the fact that he's been denied trial, et cetera, those are, for me, the things we really should worry about. So I worry less. I must be honest. This is going to be a controversial statement, but I'm happy to be challenged on it. Guys, I worry less about corruption. I worry more if it's not being reported. Right? And so what's happened here is there's been a reporting of it. I also think a lot of us have grown quite impatient with citizen number one in South Africa, and with some degree of reason, but I also think sometimes we're being unfair. Because I think what he's tried to do is to rebuild the institution. So it doesn't matter who's the president, the institutions do their work, right? So it doesn't matter who's the president, the receiver should collect cash. It doesn't matter who's the president. If there's a case to be prosecuted, the prosecutorial authority has to do its work. Doesn't matter who's the president. If there is a matter to be investigated, the police, the investigating authorities all have to do their work. So what we need is a strong institutional strength. And that's the power of the US, is whether or not Donald Trump is the president, if somebody has to be tried, you better believe somebody's going to be tried. So for me, at a macro political level, what I am heartened by is that there is an effort and an attempt to rebuild the institutions. I think a lot of us have lost a tad bit of faith because the work to rebuild institutions is very slow, right? And so we almost have to just be a bit more patient. So here's the litmus test, Richard. Guys, 24 months. That's my number. That's the magic number. It's the magic number. I literally have sent out a letter to my whole team today, this month, and it was called The Next 24 Months. I think the next 24 months are the most critical 24 months in the history of our democracy to date. Because in the next 24 months, a couple of things are going to happen. One, we go into municipal elections. We're going to see record levels of voter apathy. That's an important measure because it'll send a message to the ruling elite that people are not happy. Two, over the period of the next 24 months, we should begin to see work done by the receiver, the prosecutorial authority, as well as the investigating services come into the court system and be tried. That's also an important measure. And also over the next 24 months, we'll begin to see the coronavirus effect pull itself out of our economy. And then we'll really get a sense of where is our economy and what's the plan to rebuild it. So this massive infrastructure project that they're talking about, the 346 billion, all of those things, we have the next 24 months to really get a sense of what the picture looks like. So I know all of us are taking pressure and strain now, but my advice would be 24 months. Just watch over the next 24 months. And whatever decisions you make, at the end of the 24 months, you should be able to get a real sense of whether or not that's been the correct decision.
Great. Thanks, Vusi. And nice to see we have a question from a customer, Kivesh from Sisonke. He says, my question to Vusi is, what is his prediction for the construction industry after COVID-19? And what steps does he think we should take regarding the current economy? I think you've just touched on it, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, we wrote, so for those who don't know, I'm a board member and a partner of a research institution called Iconoclast. We penned a paper about the construction sector probably just over a year ago, and I did a round of media interviews. Richard, I'm happy to share the link of that, and you can send it to everybody who was in on this, because in there we spoke about the state of where the construction sector is. Look, here is for me the thing about the construction sector and infrastructure spending in general is, unlike many other services-based part of our GDP. So if you look at our GDP mix today, financial services, technology, consulting, growing, but what we call the income multipliers, manufacturing, construction, infrastructure, all of those are diminishing. If you read the latest plan by both Enoch Godongwana in the ANC, as well as the plan that was put forward by Business for South Africa, all of those pivot on the same point, which is rebuild what is called income multipliers. And right at the center of income multipliers is construction, as well as the infrastructure sector. So my expectation is that you're going to see a lot more conversation about how do you rebuild and how do you bring back capacity and spending into the infrastructure sector. The risk is whether or not we still have the skills. You and I were talking about this before this started, whether or not we still have the skills in the sector to capitalize on those projects, right? I think that's the risk, but only time can answer that question. If you're in the sector, my expectation is that there'll be more money coming into the sector. But again, it's going to take a little bit of time. We're going to have to be a bit patient.
Great, thanks. Another question here from Shane Moodley. He says, in your view, do we have the correct leadership in place with the correct energy and vision to materialize the opportunities available to grow the South African economy? And I suppose it's a broader question. It's not just South Africa. I think you've touched on it when you shared, the people who have got access to electricity in the number of countries on the continent. I think leadership as a whole is a challenge for us right now as we speak. But I think with the new generation of millennials coming through and people who are not stuck to the old traditional values around, because you were a liberation movement, we're going to support you for the rest of our lives, those days are gone. And I think we're going to see some change coming. But maybe your thoughts on that.
No, I 110% agree. I just want to make a comment on this. Every time I hear people say, do we have the right leadership? I want to remind you that you're part of that leadership. You're not a pedestrian or a passenger. This is your country too. So you're a part of the leadership. And this is honestly, if I can here, this is a closed conversation, so I'll share it. This is where I get disappointed by a lot of our South Africans. We just don't have the courage of our thoughts, right? If you see something is wrong, say it. You have the obligation to say it as a citizen, but more importantly, you have the right to say it. You can't sit back. And what I get really despondent by is when I see friends of mine or people I've done business with who want to say one thing in a WhatsApp group but would never say it in public. I'm going, well, that's a part of the problem. A part of the problem is that you're not willing to have the courage of your convictions, right? Now, notice, I don't know if you've seen, but if you notice how of late, sentiment has been changing and is moving away from a political elite into a broad-based consensus movement around rebuilding a South Africa that works. For the first time in a long time, you're seeing people from different political quarters going, actually, we don't agree politically, but can we agree that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doesn't work, right? And they're all kind of convening. And that's a part of what leadership is, guys. Leadership is not one person, writing a letter. That's the icon of the leader. But leadership is how community, all of us as communities, involve ourselves in the project of building a country. Look, if things go south and you're quiet, then I don't know how to say this to you nicely. You are a part of the problem. You can't be quiet. This is not a poem. Do not go gently into that good night. Say something. And it doesn't matter how you say it, whether you call into a radio station on a morning talk show or you're writing a post on Facebook, but you have to find a way to voice your discontent so that it can be registered in the ballot box of emotion. So everybody knows where we are. We're all a part of leadership. You can't sit this one out. I think that's an important point to make.
Okay, so our time's just about up, but I'm going to take just two more questions and then we can wrap up. And this one is a very nice one, and I think it's a very good question. It's a nice personal one, and it comes from Jurgens de Toit. He says, on the days when you wake up with the feeling of being able to change the world around you or feeling bulletproof, how do you reframe your thinking to still put on the superhero cap? That's like nice, for somebody who's in this space and talking to people and trying to get their energy levels up, but still be realistic and practical about where we find ourselves. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and find 8 to 9% GDP growth. We're still going to have 30% unemployment. But how do we get people just to believe that this 24 months you're talking about is a reality? How do we get people to have this bulletproof, resilient mindset?
So that's a fantastic question. And I want to make an admission. I was out of commission. I see Mimi Masala is in on this conversation. Mimi is a part of my book club. But I was out of commission for probably about 6 weeks. I wasn't available. I wasn't taking meetings. I wasn't doing webinars, nothing like that. And the reason actually was because I think I was suffering a mild case of depression. It's really hard when you've been working to build something to have to take a few steps back, right? And it's tough. I'm not gonna bullshit. It's hard when you go, we've worked to, and here's the thing, right, Richard, you'll understand this. Like, we are A-type, alpha personalities. We're about conquering and winning. And when something happens that you can't control and you have to deal with a loss, it's a tough thing to deal with. I went through about 6 months of just not feeling like I wanted it anymore, whatever it is, right? And in that time, and I just want to make this as if I can, a piece of advice as well as an observation. Allow yourself the time to take an 8 count, as we call it in boxing. It's just an 8 count. Knee to the ground, catch your breath, and take the 8 count. And that's what I did. And in that time, one of the things, it was 6 weeks, right? But in that time, I was reading ferociously. I was talking to friends, mentors, and that gave me a better sense of perspective again. So the point is, no one feels good all the time. No one feels like the hero all the time. But that's not what's expected. I think what's expected is that you see the upside, even in the presence of the risks. So by the time I got to come back into commission and I was able to do these webinars again, and I was taking engagements again, and I was meeting with my teams again, I was clear on what the downside risk was, the things we had to do to manage that downside risk, but always keeping an eye on the upside risk. And I think that's just balance it. Do not BS yourself into thinking that issues are not real or that the problems don't exist. Because it's a bit like gravity. If you go to the top floor of the Carlton Center and jump, whether or not you believe in gravity, you're going to land on the floor. That's the way gravity works. So too are the macroeconomic factors that are affecting us. You can't pretend it's not there. So deal with the reality of the moment that you're in. Just calm, centered, clear at the moment.
Thanks, Vusi. Okay, so folks, I realize we're out of time, but I'm going to just do this one last one. So please hang in there, another 2 minutes, and then we'll be done. And this is from Mandla Skosana. He says, hi, Vusi. Firstly, thanks to the AfriSam team for bringing this together. Very necessary. Thanks for that recognition, Mandla. The question is, how does a young construction business operating in an informal environment get to tap into the striking relationship with organizations such as AfriSam? So maybe that's not a question for Vusi. Maybe that's one I will take. So Mandla, with the change in what's happened in the construction industry, and we all know what's happened to the big 5 or big 6, we've seen the likes of Basil Reed, Group 5, etc. I mean, there is no one company that is bulletproof. When things go wrong, it affects any size company. And I mean, if you study the history of companies like Group 5, Basil Reed, etc., and you realize how they've gotten to the top, and then we all know what happened post the 2010 and the Competition Commission getting involved, and a number of things that unfortunately went wrong. And one can talk a lot about all of this, but what it has done is it has created an opportunity for small, medium-sized construction companies to rise. Sometimes bad things happen for a reason, and we may not always appreciate it and enjoy it. And my heart goes out to companies like Group 5 who have done fantastic work in this country to build our infrastructure. But when things like that happen, it does create opportunities even for suppliers like us to refocus and say, hold on, these are not the only customers you should be focusing on going forward. There are small emerging companies that can offer a lot of value, and maybe you need to start engaging with these smaller companies that you have ignored for many years because you focused purely on the bigger construction companies. And that is certainly the case. So we look at a number of things, the conservative views we took around credit worthiness, looking at smaller companies and looking at their track records and saying, well, you know what, they are high risk. We've started to take a different view on smaller companies and said, how are they going to get a track record if you don't give them a chance? If we're not prepared to take a bit more risks, how are these small companies going to get a chance? So we have relaxed a lot of the issues around looking at credit worthiness of smaller companies. I mean, we still have to be rational and reasonable about how we look at these things, but we have started to focus on engaging with smaller, medium-sized construction companies. If you look at AfriSam's approach to customer experience, whilst we're at a very tough time in our industry, and there is a huge focus on reducing fixed cost and concentrating mainly on variable cost and driving the bottom line and preserving jobs, we are also taking a very strategic, balanced view on not dropping customer service, customer experience, engaging with smaller, medium-sized business. It's a difficult thing to convince, shareholders and funders and people who look at your balance sheet and say, well, in a tough time, you should be focusing on cutting, sustaining the business, keeping it afloat. But you have to take a balanced view, and you have to take a forward-looking view and say, this business still has to run for another 85 years, God willing. And we have to also start thinking about how we position ourselves tactically and strategically. And small, medium-sized business is definitely on the agenda for AfriSam. It's definitely a customer base that we are looking to grow. Our ready-mix business, our aggregates businesses, we are all, even the cement business. I mean, it's not an easy time for our industry right now, but it is a time to recalibrate, to relook at things, to look at the entire value chain, and to look at who are these little businesses that are going to make a difference in times to come. Is it an easy solution? No, it's not. I'm not going to lie to you and say we're just going to sign on every small customer. But if they are credible, really hardworking, talented individuals who have a vision and a plan and need support, we are certainly going to be there to walk this journey with them. So we're going to post this webinar on our website. We have got the contact details of the people who have signed in, who are our customers. If you do need to engage further, if we need to get salespeople to come and see you after this, we will certainly do that. But thank you all for signing in. We really appreciate it. I think the value of this was also not just to give information and advice to our own staff and our own people, but also to share valuable information with customers and people outside of AfriSam, the broader stakeholder group. So once again, from the time we had Dr. Azar Jamin all the way to now, when we've got Vusi, giving us a perspective on life beyond the crisis and trying to give us this hope that, we've had the Asian flu, we've had lots of other pandemics in the past, and the world has survived. And maybe for some of us, it's going to be tough, but we have to, someone like me who's got a young kid at university, who's first year at varsity, I cannot afford to be negative. I have to get this young chap through university. He's got a life. And my encouragement on the back of Vusi's very inspirational presentation is, let's think about the next generation, and let's think about how we voice our concerns and how we show our political leaders that we want a better South Africa. We cannot be stuck in the past. We cannot be doing things as they've always been done. We have a beautiful country, lots of great people like Vusi who are out here to help and inspire. And for those of you who are online, leading people, managing teams, as difficult as things may be right now, it is incumbent on all of us to stay true to our values and to deliver. Thank you, Vusi. Thank you all for signing in. God bless. Stay well. Stay healthy. Keep the mask on. Sanitize. Do all the right things that we need to do in order to prevent the spread of the virus. God bless. Take care.
Cheers.
Cheers.